Nice. Okay, now we're on. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this episode, we are joined once again by Frank Ledwidge talking about the continuing Russian war against Ukraine. Dr. Frank Ledwidge is from the UK's University of Portsmouth and is barrister, author, and former British military officer who served in the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Frank, welcome back to The Focus.
Thanks, John. Great to be back.
Frank, the winter conditions are looking pretty bleak. At the moment, we're seeing temperatures in the -7 to -10 range. Russian missiles are pummeling Ukraine's power supply with some 20% of it offline through damage and destruction, leaving many Ukrainians in the dark and without heat. Will General Winter come back to restore Russia's fortunes?
John, I think it's likely to be the reverse. Let's deal first with the strategic assault on the Ukrainian people, which you mentioned there. By strategic, I mean that the method that the Russians are using is quite an old one. It's the same one that we used in the Second World War to try and undercut the morale, destroy actually the morale of the German people with our bombing campaigns. It's called the Combined Bomber Offensive. I'm not going to get into that in detail, but enough to say that the British essentially used what we'll call morale bombing. The Americans used techniques more military or industrial focus. And the British element, I think it's fair to say, huge debates over this, but the first morale bombing offensive failed because the intention was to turn the German people against their government. And what it did was make German people, A, display resilience, and B, rather more blame the bombers than blame their government. And that pattern's been repeated time and again throughout military history. The attempt to attack the morale of civilian populations, of ordinary people, generally fails. That most recently happened, in my experience, or rather, within my experience, it happened in Kosovo in 1999, where we did much the same. It's often forgotten, this kind of thing. We did much the same to try and affect the campaign against the Serbian people. Now, that campaign succeeded, taking out their electricity, attacking various industries and so forth, taking down bridges. But it didn't succeed because of that. It succeeded because we successfully attacked the interests of the leadership, which is a much far different thing. And we also forget that this is exactly what we did in 1991 and in 2003 in Iraq. Again, successful operations had nothing to do with taking down electricity and so forth. So what the Russians are doing is trying the same thing. They're trying to undermine the will of the Ukrainian people to continue the fight. Now, is that succeeding? Self-evidently not. So from the anecdotal perspective, I talk to Ukrainians quite regularly. I've got lots of Ukrainian friends. Most recently, I was there last summer for a couple of months. And one person, and not the only one, by the way, they phrase it differently, said, if our response is not fear, but cold fury. And you see that, of course, on the media as well, but that to me summarized the effect of these things. So the attempt to assault Ukrainian people's will to fight is failing. And that may result in greater flows of refugees. It probably will. And indeed, the Ukrainian government has said it would be wise to leave if you can afford it, simply because it's very uncomfortable, of course, being in the cold. Which brings us on to the second point, which is General Winter. The reference there is to the common supposition that winter always rescues the Russians, as it did in 1812 and in 1941, the winter of 1941. In this war, it's likely to be the other way around, because the Ukrainians are far better prepared, the Ukrainian military far better prepared. Yeah, I mean, I could go on at some length about that, but that's pretty, I don't want to turn this into a monologue.
No, look, it's interesting. When you look at the history of bombing campaigns, as you rightly point out, I mean, there have been many psychological studies that show quite clearly that history doesn't bear out that, bombing a population in order to change the morale of the population has ever really worked. I mean, what are the Russians doing in terms of their overarching strategic preparation? You know, this is strategy 101 for most people in the West. Why didn't they get that? Why are they pursuing this old method of warfare?
I don't know the inner workings of the Russian command. It seems to me that they have confused some success they had in places like Chechnya and Syria with by leveling cities with the attempt to undermine the will to fight. Again, those were wrong lessons. In Aleppo, the bombing of I think it was eastern part of the city, did result in success, you can call it that. But the attacks reduced not so much the civilian will to fight, that was irrelevant there. It was reduced the capability of the rebels to do so. Civilian will to fight that in Aleppo was irrelevant. It was neither here nor there. The civilians just got caught in the middle. Yeah. In Chechnya, the leveling of Grozny twice, as it wasn't quite leveled, in fact, it was leveled on the second occasion. It was very seriously damaged. Again, the result was the civilians were irrelevant there. The will to fight of rebels, the fighters was far more relevant there, and even in that circumstance, it didn't stop them. So it may well be they're taking confused lessons, but it's an entirely different animal anyway. What they did in Grozny and Aleppo to what they're attempting here is, as you suggest, far more reminiscent of our activities in Kosovo, in Germany, most importantly Germany. It's the major counter example here. Yeah. As you said, there's loads of studies on it. Very, very few scholars, very few historians would suggest that the morale bombing campaign anywhere has had any positive effect. It just turns people against it. It reinforces their will to fight. But there's been another theory advanced, John, only over the last week, which is, and I think it's equally woolly, is the purpose is to demonstrate to Ukrainians the inviolability of their state. And again, you know, that's the terrorist rationale. You know, you can't. If the government can't provide you with basic security or basic needs, then it's not a government you should be supporting. And of course, terrorism doesn't work either. So look, you know, on the positive side, on the plus side of the ledger for the Russians, at least they seem to have found some sort of consistent approach. But it's unfortunately for them, unfortunately for the rest of us, it's not going to work.
So there have been some who have been suggesting that Russia has started using its older strategic missiles by simply removing nuclear warheads and replacing them with conventional ones. Does this signify that Russia indeed has a conventional missile problem?
I'm not sure I buy the premise that they've taken nuclear warheads off missiles. They may have done, but I'm not sure if this is a. And we've heard from the start of the war that the Russians are running out of missiles. So you had assessments early on in March or so that they'd used half of their arsenal, and we hear the same sort of figures again now. Sure, the rate of usage of cruise missiles and of ballistic missiles seems to have reduced. The alternative, to the extent they can use it, is to use S-300 anti-aircraft missiles, a range of them, maybe a couple hundred kilometers maximum, as at the tactical level, which I think they have been doing. But the S-300 missile was always intended to be multifunctional, and there is a that's an anti-aircraft missile. There is a mark of the S-300 which was purely designed really for ground attack, and it can put 200 or 300 kilograms on a target, and there's thousands of those according to analysts. But at the sort of longer range, I've become a bit skeptical about this, to be honest. We've been hearing a long time that they're running out of missiles, and yet these salvos seem to come in. They haven't yet started using Iranian ballistic missiles. That's to say,
that's true. Yeah.
But the the analysts say they're likely to do so when they get the purchase and the supplies through. Although I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians have a say in that somewhere.
Mhm.
So I mean, yeah, the rate of usage has been reduced, but it just seems to me, it's cry wolf thing. I mean, there's one problem here, John. That I hesitate to say, but I think it's true, that we don't see the other side here. If we want to have a dispassionate analysis of the war,
Yeah.
we're not. Every day we hear and I read them all. British intelligence analyses. And back at the start of the war, I would say, "Oh, this is great that they're doing this." And it is. It's great propaganda. It's great info ops. But they're relentlessly positive.
Yes, they
what
are.
we don't hear, we don't hear is the other side. And to the extent, it's not really a criticism; it's just an observation. But back to the point on missile supplies. Sure, they're running low. And another thing, I think they have to keep back a pretty considerable supply against any NATO intervention. So I think many of their most serious capabilities in the air, missiles are being held back. I also believe that, or from what I've heard and read, that the Russians are having big problems in getting the chips.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. Part of the whole international sanctions regime shows now that Russia is going to find it very difficult to replace anything with a chip in it, which then has some, quite catastrophic outcomes for, replacing weapons lost or ramping up production of certain weapons. And you will find that probably missiles, their circular error of probability is going to be all over the joint, quite frankly, because the circular error of probability, for those in our audience who don't know, is the accuracy of the missile warhead on a target. Now, if you don't have the chip that is, guiding the missile to your target, the likelihood of it ending up in a kindergarten as opposed to, government headquarters, for instance, is extraordinarily high. So collateral damage becomes a major issue here as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how this actually works its way through the Russian military supply chain, because even things like tanks, tanks are the great brutalist instrument that was first created for World War I conditions. But now they've moved from being these brutalist instruments to being highly sophisticated land ships, if you will, with all kinds of sensors on board. And if you don't have the sensors, you've got no capacity to use your armored forces correctly.
I don't know if you saw this. There was I saw this from a couple of sources. Is that the washing machine trope? The soldiers stealing washing machines.
Yeah.
One interpretation of that is that washing machines. I know this sounds facetious, but made seriously. Washing machines are full of chips, because of all the settings they have to, and apparently the same chips you would use. You'll know better than me, but the same or similar chips you'd use. I mean, they are of course transferable. And for some reason, they were ordered. Soldiers were ordered to get the washing machines and every other appliance that they could get their hand off. Washing machines, of course, being the largest, was chip supply. And of course, that brings in China, doesn't it? I guess you know more about this. And that's where China can influence this. I think it's very dangerous for China, though. I guess there's a forensic trace for where these things come from. I think there is. So it'd be very dangerous. And needless to say, I think the Ukrainians examine every missile they can find. Just reports are made because they're valuable items. And if they've got a Tochka or Calibra that doesn't go off, or the bits as they regularly are around that, every strike is examined except on the battlefield. So they will know where the chips come from, and of course British, Australian, American, and other allied forces get the take from that, and that's in the public domain, where the chips come from.
So I suppose the Chip Act then didn't just haul over the Chinese because of their interest in taking over Taiwan. So we wanted to hobble the Chinese military. It was also in case the Chinese were passing on chips surreptitiously to the Russians for them to ramp up production and, make good their loss replacements, basically.
Yeah, I think that would be considered, subverting on a hostile act. Much the same way. I mean, these are enablers as much as the S or Shahid 136 Iranian drones are. They're combat enablers.
Yeah.
And I think China's very leery of that. It's interesting the role China's played actually in this. It's been quite restraining on Russia, particularly on the nuclear thing. It's not out of beneficence, of course. It's out of their own interest. Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious about that, though. I mean, all right, so the Chinese obviously do have a role to play in all of this. You know, they are the senior partner in the Sino-Russian entente, if you want to call it that. But in the end, it seems to me that if the Chinese were, you know, trying to sort of manage Russia's expectations, Putin doesn't seem to be the kind of person that would really not be chafing under Xi's bit. Let's have a look at that nuclear issue, because I know that last April when we spoke to you, you know, the whole nuclear threat issue came up, and it was a very existential one for Europe and the world. But of course, all that talk came to nothing. There was there was some suggestion that Xi was, pushing Putin to scale back on his nuclear threats, but ultimately he's the gambler, right? He's the ultimate gambler. If he sees that letting off a nuke, not necessarily against a Ukrainian city or a Ukrainian military target, but just let's one off in the Black Sea, for instance, just to demonstrate that there is an escalatory ladder that he's prepared to move up. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I still see him thinking this one through as a realistic option. What are your thoughts?
I completely agree to the extent that, on this unrealistic, realistic scale. But I just want to just cut back, and then I'm not avoiding the question to the China thing. It's not really just the China aspect of this, but also India. India's been much more Modi, that is to say, and much more vociferous. We don't, in public, berating Putin. I think it was in Astana or Mate, anyway, wherever it was. We cannot allow this to continue. And India is a very, very important. I mean, Russia doesn't really have any allies. It has Armenia, I think, technically, and Belarus, but and even Armenia's lukewarm. But it does have occasional friends, and India's a very important one for many reasons, not least the huge trade in energy and weapons that goes between them. Modi's been very, very negative about the war, again, for national interest, and quite appropriately. But anyway, back to the nuclear thing, which is absolutely fascinating. Yeah. So you mentioned that escalatory ladder, and just a couple of background points, which is I've found quite telling. So first, in the UK, we've got a strategic nuclear capability, as you know, and I understand that as of February or March this year, there was this one single nuclear strategist employed by our Ministry of Defence. So the idea and the thinking of nuclear thinking and nuclear theorising, which of course dominated war studies and strategic studies up to the 80s, it's died, or rather it became moribund for the last 30 years, and it's now being resurrected by strategists. So we're a bit short on thinking, I think, all our countries on this, and I think that's going to change pretty soon as people start getting spun up again on the ideas and theories of the practice, actually, of the 80s. But, this idea of escalatory ladder, of course, is fairly straightforward. I would submit, though, that there are a number of other rungs on that ladder, which will or may be stepped upon. So you have, for example, and you'll know what these are, you've got chemical weapons, perhaps, although they're limited use. We have seen them. We've seen no indications, by the way. You'd want to see tactical indications they're going to be deployed, and then can, of course, cut two ways, as everybody in the First World War found out. We used them as much as the Germans there. It blew back as much on us as it did on them. Yeah. Effectively, they were same for the Iranians and Iraqis. I spent 6 months in Iraq, including with this very, very fine Australian colleagues, looking for these chemical weapons and finding them actually from that period, and becoming intimately familiar with what they did and where they did it. And you can use them for tactical purposes, and they will cut holes in lines for your enemies and prepare, but it cuts two ways. So we can look at that. But I think much more apposite, we're not really over or rather by over, I mean, we're not really aware of what Russians and Ukrainians, Americans, Australians, Brits, and all the other leading cyber powers have been doing in that domain. And it's my understanding, just from listening and reading people again, that the cyber fight has been a bit more vicious than we're given to believe.
Mm.
But there are, of course, cyber weapons the Russians can use against us that I suspect they haven't yet used. So there's that domain. There's also, of course, much more crucially, even more crucially, equally crucially, I suppose, if it's done right, is the space domain, where Russia has the capability to take down satellites. I think it's very unlikely they'll start attacking American constellations. I think that there's a number of blowback effects on that. But I think attacking data links and things like that could be done. And then, of course, you get to the low yield or so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Now, I've got fairly strong views about this, and I don't think they're uncommon, these views. The scenario you posited of a demonstrative strike, perhaps, or an airburst over the Black Sea to show, we're willing to do this, or over an uninhabited part of Ukraine, if there are any, and there are. It's not going to happen over Russia or any area Russia claims. It's possible, but look, here's the thing. I think there is, and I hesitate to use the term here, there is a physical red line on this. I think there's a crucial point where we really need to start worrying. So the saber rattling from Putin and his gang ceased and desisted in its most recent iteration in late October, mid-October, when Jake Sullivan, I think, had a quiet word with Jake Sullivan being the US National Security Advisor with I can't remember his name now for the moment.
With Lavrov.
No, yeah, well, Lavrov was there, but there's a National Security Advisor. I think of his name anyway. Whoever it was, yeah, Lavrov. Let's say, with the gang. To the effect, I think, look, this needs to stop because we're going to start taking it seriously, and that's not going to rebound well on you. And so that saber rattling stopped around then. However, and this is a massive however, with the taking of Kherson, Ukraine now stands at the gates of Crimea.
Yeah.
So they've got the big river to cross, but they don't need to cross that river. They can cut down through the fairly flat areas of southern Zaporizhia down to that coast. So now I was in Eastern Europe in September, and I met a friend of mine who's a dissident Russian, and been arrested many times in Moscow and so forth, and they just had enough. And at the last moment, I think, before she was jailed, came to a certain town in Eastern Europe, and she said, "Look, Kherson is obviously Ukrainian. Kherson, Zaporizhia is the most Ukrainian province there is. It's the Cossack heartland, Ukrainian Cossack heartland, and nobody cares much about that so-called Novorossiya, that southern coast.
Yeah. But
everyone knows that Crimea is Russian." And she included in that people like Navalny, who's in solitary confinement now, and has made it very clear that, like almost all Russians, Crimea belongs to us, let's say. So I think when if the Ukrainians decide, as they might, and as they said they would, to attempt a retake of Crimea, I think things will change radically, because that's where Russian nationalism really will kick in. That's where this becomes a war, not so much of, as everyone, surely not everyone, but many people, including the political nation, know very well, is a, let's call it for our purpose, a war of aggression. That's where it becomes different, takes on a different nature. And that's where Russian nuclear doctrine becomes much more relevant, because you're looking there at the existence of the state. And I would think that, and you do see this, John, now, don't you, that American leaders, military, particularly so far military, are saying to the Ukrainians, just hold your horses here for the moment. And I can see some serious discussions being had between US and Ukrainian leaders. I think Europeans are irrelevant, as to the wisdom of proceeding beyond the Perekop Isthmus, which is the small sort of land bridge about 5K wide that leads into Crimea. It's the main point of entry. We could discuss, if you like, lots of battles there in the past. But if they cross that, I think we're looking at a serious situation. That's where the let's call it tactical or low yield nuclear issue comes in. What do you think?
Oh, sorry, Frank. Tell me something about your observations with regard to the US-Ukraine relationship. We recently had this war escalation scare with a reputedly Russian missile entering and hitting a farm in Poland.
Yeah.
And of course, rather than give the Russians the benefit of the doubt, we accuse them outright. And actually it was a stray Ukrainian, bit of kit that
Yeah,
flew over.
yeah. I think the Americans were pretty quick on that. That once the Poles had established their position, which was very firm and very sensible,
Mm.
I thought quite. I'm not saying surprisingly, but markedly. Right, this was a Ukrainian missile. It's an unfortunate accident, but it wouldn't have been fired had the Russians not been been immiserating the people of Lviv or wherever it was with their bombs. Mm. And Zelensky's mistake there, I think, was to continue this story that it was somehow a deliberate strike. I mean, why they would be attacking a farm in, wherever it is near Lublin is another matter. But a very big info ops mistake. But this raises your question or your point. It's a massive issue. It's really interesting, this. So if you think about it, and I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine who leads a think tank in Ukraine, and we were discussing US strategy, and I made the observation with which she disagreed, and some of your listeners might, and I think it's a matter of interpretation, but I think it's a very strong argument for saying the Americans haven't yet declared a strategy, haven't yet declared an objective for this for them. What they've said is we support the Ukrainians, and Lloyd Austin, in a perhaps unguarded moment in April, said, our job or our objective is to damage the Russians so that they can't do this to anyone else again.
Yeah.
Now that's a very different objective to Ukraine retaking its land. Right? So what that implies is that and I know this is a realist approach, is that they'd be quite, not saying happy, but they would be quite content for this war to go on as long as it continues to bleed Russia. And so I'm not spouting conspiracies here. I'm not saying this is sinister. It's an entirely realist approach, and it accords entirely with what Lloyd Austin said. And it's the only expression of American objectives, he said the West, but that's the same thing, that we've heard from the US. Now, here's the thing. We've had transfers of weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces now for the last 9 months. They've been very effective and been important. They've not been decisive. So what they've allowed Ukraine to do, which is the declared, if you read the American Lend-Lease Act, it doesn't talk about Ukraine retaking its land, it talks about defending Ukrainian territory. Yeah. So American Lend-Lease is explicitly designed at the moment to hold off the Russians. So what we see is from the US, lots of artillery, essentially artillery, right? That's the main capability. Plus, let's not forget this, which is never mentioned, and quite rightly so, is intelligence, surveillance, and target acquisition, which is being done by Western assets, quite rightly. But what we've not seen, and the HIMARS and so on, which is artillery, what we've not seen is any capability which would allow or assist the Ukrainians in offensive combined arms operations. So by that, I mean tanks, armored fighting vehicles, ATACMS, which is long-range artillery, by the 200 or 300 kilometers to 200 miles. We've not seen any of that. Now, the Americans have that kit in quantity. So let me give you an example now. General Zaluzhny, who's the chief of staff of the Ukrainian armed forces, quite interesting. Selected not through seniority, but through the fact he was a bit of a maverick. It's very interesting. To me, very interesting in terms of culture. But anyway, General Zaluzhny wrote a long piece for one of the Ukrainian outlets in September, outlining his views of how 2023 should go and will go. And he posits as the central of gravity of Russia, Crimea. So you can understand why that is. We discussed that just briefly before. Yeah. Now, he said, what we're going to do is we're going to put together 10 to 20 brigades in order to retake our land. And it may take all year. I'd commend it to your viewers. I'll send you the link if you want.
Yes, please.
It's quite a good read. So then what he says is what we need for that is an increased, a step, basically use this term, but basically we need a step change in Western assistance in order to equip these brigades. Because if you look at it now, all the weaponry, tanks, armored vehicles, all the tanks, I think maybe, no, I think all tanks have been ex-Soviet tanks, unwanted leftovers from NATO countries. Most anti-aircraft systems, Western, they're defensive. Not that there's any particular, I'm not going to get into the defensive offensive thing for the moment. But there have been no Western aircraft, no Western tanks, and no significant long-range capabilities. HIMARS is not long-range. So what Challenge wants, and in my view needs, and should have, in brackets, is a re-equipment of Ukrainian army. And that can be effected if the will is there by the United States over the next few months in the form of 500 to 1,000 Abrams tanks, which would be a small fraction of those they have in storage, and they're a generation ahead of any Russian tank. Even the older ones are, the fire control system. Similar number of armored personnel carriers, or armored fighting vehicles, as they're called, Bradleys, which are little tanks which hold soldiers, those who aren't nerds on this like me, and long-range HIMARS rockets, which would allow the Ukrainians to challenge things like the Black Sea Fleet without leaving, from where they are now, basically, or Russian air bases in Crimea, and also consider aircraft too. Most people talk about the F-16 there, but I think the F-16 is a bit exquisite for Russia, for Ukrainian runways, and we might want to look at something slightly different, like maybe the Hornet that Australia had for a long time, or the Saab Gripen. But look, getting into the capabilities is all very nerdy and interesting, but the point is the Americans have the capability to give the Ukrainians the ability to win the war quickly on the ground, and they're not doing so. So then we have to ask why that is. And is that because the real strategy behind Western assistance is to bleed the Russian army dry, which implies a long conflict and a grinding attritional conflict? Or is it the strategy of the West to enable the Ukrainians to retake that land? Those are two very different things. At the moment, what we see on the ground is it seems to be the former.
What's really interesting, though, in spite of the poor performance that the Russian military has demonstrated quite clearly, you mentioned earlier that it's likely that the Russians are holding back a lot of their capabilities, their air assets, space hasn't really come into the equation, not in a big way. No. But these are high-level strategic assets that Russia could call upon. Now, my question would be, is there this conspiracy on the Russian side to squirrel away a bunch of its equipment because, if they do get into a dust-up with NATO, then they'll bring out the big guns and, then the Russian Rommels within the ranks will rise to the surface and we'll see Europe transformed? Yeah. Or is it going to be a case of all the stuff they're keeping in reserve is as badly run as the stuff that we're seeing in Ukraine, in which case, why the hell don't they just pour that stuff into Ukraine, burn it all off, and then in the post-war settlement, they can start recreating a modern Russian army? I mean, you have to operate with the cards that you're being dealt, right? And if the cards aren't being dealt well with Russia, then utilize the assets that you have. Don't put them aside for a rainy day. The rainy day is now.
Yeah, you would think so, and I think that also applies to the West. Frankly, we're in the rainy day now. I'll come back to the West in a second and address the Russian thing. Yeah. I think it just makes operational sense for orders to be given by Gerasimov, who's the Russian military commander, and a very sensible and well-known, very, very clever man. And there are, this is the odd thing, and there are some very, very impressive people, and have been on the Russian side as there are on the Ukrainian side. Gerasimov chief amongst them. I would be really surprised, genuinely surprised, and it would be very foolish for Russia not to hold back. Let's say, for example, some, and you mentioned them yourself, the best air assets they have, and not risk them over a a fairly dense air defense blanket.
Mm.
Some of the best anti-aircraft missiles too, S-400s, because they may well land, and they will land in Ukrainian territory, for example, and be examined and countermeasures applied. Same for the aircraft. I think with respect to tanks, they probably use most of them.
Mm.
Space, you've said, cyber, you've said, and it's those strategic capabilities I think they're particularly holding back. But I also think they're holding back, I mean, look, I don't think, it just makes sense to me. They had a good 20 to 30% of their arsenal of ballistic missiles and precision cruise missiles and that kind of thing. They need an arsenal for that. Let me give you an example of how you might use that quickly in a conflict with NATO. Let's say so we've seen the Black Sea Fleet, which is essentially emasculated now because they lost their flagship, and the Ukrainians seem to have the capability to attack Sebastopol. So the Black Sea Fleet is the weakest of Russia's three fleets. You have the Northern Fleet out of Murmansk, which is their ballistic missile sort of heart, and all the escort fleets there, which or capabilities, major surface ships, very capable submarines, and they're the ones that tend to end up in the Atlantic, frigates and destroyers and whatnot. Same with the Baltic Fleet. Now these have a capability to strike NATO from the west, and let's say particularly the UK. So I'm 6 miles here from RAF, Royal Air Force Brize Norton, which is our only major transport hub. There's nothing to stop cruise missiles launched in the southern Irish Sea from hitting Brize Norton and taking it out tomorrow morning. We don't have anti-missile systems, and the fighters wouldn't get there to shoot them down quick enough. As simple as that now. Yeah. It's just a tactical reality. It's just a question of drawing circles on maps. And that kind of strike, limited in nature, would emasculate our air force very quickly. And that I think it's that kind of capability that the Russians are retaining in reserve, plus their long-range air force, which is used really just as bomb trucks for missiles. They fly them over Belarus, they fly them off at Kiev, and they fly back again. So all of those assets are in place and remain, and both in the northern part of Russia, which is the Northern Fleet sector, and in Western Russia too. So I think it's that kind of strategic level asset that really threatens us, that they're keeping back, and I'm sure our intelligence they will be very aware of that, rather than 1,000 tanks or something, which aren't going to be much use anyway against NATO. I think they're expending those, as you say there. So it's the strategic level assets; those can really cause damage or really cause pain to us. The submarine fleets obviously aren't being used, and why would they be? They're no use. Russia remains a very, very significant military capability. It's their army that have suffered very badly in Ukraine. I think the army that's expending itself in the way that you said, but the other assets are very much in place and could cause us a lot of damage. Not as much damage as we, the West, could cause Russia, but that's not the point.
Well, okay. If I hear you correctly, then I mean, there is still a genuine fear of the Russian military in spite of what we're seeing in Ukraine. But let me play a little bit of a hypothetical with you here. So in 1991, the world was shocked with how quickly the Americans used air power to dispatch the forces of Saddam Hussein, which, well, it was effectively a Soviet-style military structure. It was knocked out, and when the army swept in, except for a few notable pockets of resistance, there was no massive Iraqi force lying in wait, right? Yeah. So, adversaries like China went to school and wanted to learn everything they could about 1991 and how the Americans won the war. I would imagine Russian officers would have been in a similar kind of situation, because the Russians have always had a very ambiguous relationship with the West, especially in the 1990s post-Soviet era. It was never really a friend. It was never really a foe, but we always remembered the Soviets, and Russians were Soviets. And so, they're probably an enemy. Okay. And and the Russians probably felt the same way about the West in that sense. But, but in that case, their strategic bias against having learned the lessons of 1991 and focused on strategic air power linked with space linked with missiles, you know, in a seamless fashion. When you look at the opportunities that they could have had, because they do have the assets, why didn't they just run a 1991 Gulf War style operation against Ukraine, invest all their air assets, blast the crap out of Kiev, and then leave nothing, you know, in the way for their armored columns to just move in and take over? There is an opportunity, I think, that was certainly missed at a strategic level by the Russians. And and again, when you look at what you've just said about, you know, they're keeping a fair percentage of their, you know, premier forces abroad, then you have to wonder, well, would they be then flexible enough to then try to learn from the experience in Ukraine and not kind of repeat it in other theaters of combat?
Couple of responses to that. So we are still trying to work out why it is they didn't do exactly what you said. And there's quite a lot of studies been done on that. So let's take the air piece, which is probably what I know best. And I'm not saying I'm a world expert, but I probably know more than most people about it. So what happened there was that what we failed to understand was that Russia was not us, and was nowhere, it had nothing like the ability that the West has to coordinate large-scale air operations over a long period of time. It took us, which is to say the West, including Australia, over Afghanistan. Well, okay, we had no opposition, effectively no opposition in Afghanistan. That's not the point. We still developed the systems and networks to operate air power in an extremely sophisticated and multi-dimensional way. So it would be very common over Afghanistan, for example, to have 50 aircraft, very common, of one kind or another, waiting for instruction, either for close air support or other forms of strike, or for that matter, transport, medical, and all the other things. And it takes a long time and a lot of experience to build up that capability, and the Russians never did that. And what we saw over Syria was that the Russian Air Force looked pretty formidable. You had the occasional precision strike. I've had lots of precision strikes, which are usually directed against civilian or horrible targets that produce horrible results, non-combatants, casualties, deaths, and horrors. But when people took, and I'm talking about, you know, these are the serious experts, and they're eating a bit of humble pie now, and they'll say that in those words. What we failed to see was that the Russian Air Force was not 10 feet tall, and that many of those operations, in fact, all of those operations, were single or two aircraft on specific strike missions. You didn't have the layered form of deployment of air power that we can do. You had over Aleppo, for example, there were no precision strikes, but you had their strategic air force, sorry, their long range air force, BDS, I think it's called. They dropping iron bombs with no precision guidance, and we thought, well, that's because that's what they do. You know, carpet bomb places, as it's called, and that's true, they did. But what we didn't think was, well, maybe they don't have lots of precision bombs and can't use them in a similar way that we can. So just to return to the point then, this was a huge mystery. I remember saying it myself at the time, you know, had we been doing this, we would have spent 50 days or 100 days, as we did in the war you referred to in Iraq in 1991. We spent 100 days in annihilating Iraqi air defenses and attriting, as it's called, grinding down their ground forces. And then it was a 3-day ground campaign. The Russians spent no days on the air campaign, and the boots went across the border immediately. And that's very much against our thinking. Russian thinking, of course, was governed by two things. First, that the Ukrainian will to fight would collapse and everybody would, if not welcome, then tolerate Russian presence. And secondly, that the army was capable of doing what it was ordered to do, even under those circumstances. Yeah. What we found was the army is caught out by ill discipline, above all, by gross corruption, penetrated and eaten through by weevils of graft and theft, inefficiency, and it was simply not capable of even carrying out those orders. Now, here's a big caveat, though, that one thing that, and all of those things you could say, with the exception of the corruption, just inefficiency and murder that had done this to the Russian army in 1939, this is exactly what happened. You know, mutatis mutandis, let's say, in Finland in 1939, 1940. They were defeated by the Finns. They achieved their objectives, but they were essentially defeated. And then, of course, defeated large, although the extent of the defeat is often overstated, by Barbarossa in 1941. They learned pretty quickly. And we mustn't underestimate the capability of the Russian military complex to learn quickly and be ruthlessly efficient in that. It's a very dynamic situation, warfare, and it's contingent on both sides' interaction, as Clausewitz puts it, common sense puts it. And what I think we're going to see, I think we're going to see, is a slightly more efficient Russian army that leverages what advantages it has, such as manpower. Although that's doubtful, even, to be fair, but we'll use it rather better under a commander who does seem to be a bit more switched on. Suvorikov was the first.
Do they still have any left?
Yeah. They've lost 10 now, I think. But they've stopped using them, right? Losing them now. There's been no general kill, and the reason for that is they've learned, right? We don't make phone calls. We don't. We look after our SIGINT. We are not in predictable places. We don't provide ourselves as targets. We don't be brave and go to the front line. It's all stupid, and it doesn't play well when we get killed. So, there's one small aspect. I'm not here to advocate for the Russian army's capabilities, but another thing is, you see, this is another amazing thing, but anyway, that's been corrected now. So they didn't have a theatre commander till October. Now they have, which is to say, a commander for all operations. It's General Suvorikov. They had before that Dvornikov, who was a commander in the south. All these guys are Syrian veterans, and I think they were using Syrian. They were modelling their Syrian experiences on Ukraine, which is a mistake. The latest commander, Suvorikov, I think, is a bit. It seems to be slightly more flexible in his thinking. I wouldn't be surprised if we'll see the Russians learn. However, the problem is you can only use what you have, and they do have a massive problem now with the losses they've taken, to be fair. But so have the Ukrainians. You forget.
And this comes down to another major issue here. Now, in the hope of being able to support Ukraine to the point where they nobble the Russians, we've been handing Ukraine some pretty good kit, but that kit is very difficult to replace, even in the Western inventory situation, right? So we're starting to deplete our stocks. We're going back to the companies saying, well, okay, we need to ramp up production because we're handing hundreds of missiles off to the, shoulder-launched missiles to the Ukrainians. What have you got for us? And, well, maybe it's going to be a couple of years before we can start, thinking about doing X, Y, and Z. So in a sense, Ukraine is actually bleeding the Western supporters dry of the critical equipment that we need in case the Russians were to cross over into Moldova or go off on a rampage elsewhere. So here we have a problem again with how do we manage our capacities, our military capacities, and yet still be a good friend and ally to the Ukrainians while they're, wanting to punish the Russians for their transgressions.
Yeah, totally. It's a massive problem, and it bespeaks to me of. I wrote a book in 2011 called "Losing Small Wars," which is about Iraq and Afghanistan, and how basically all misconceived and failed and shouldn't be fought. Which, anyway, got some criticism at the time, but less so now. Let's
Good on you.
Well, in the conclusion there, I said perhaps we should be focusing a little bit more on, rather than chasing rather poor and ill-armed peasants around the Muslim world, we should rather be considering where our real enemies lie, which is Russia and China. Now, it doesn't matter what I said and I told you so, etc. But what that reflected was, for 20 years, we had the displacement activity of doing precisely that, chasing ill-armed peasants around Muslim countries and killing them, often killing non-combatants. And to know counted zero strategic advantage to any of us, negatives. Anyway, putting that aside, but the point is that was displacement activity. And one of the things it displaced was a proper industrial military strategy. So, for example, the Royal Air Force, British Air Force, attacked Libya along with everyone else, not Australia, I think, in 2011. And after 3 days, the Royal Air Force ran out of missiles because, of course, it's scaled not for attacking an air defense system, as Libya had, however ramshackle and poor it was, totally ineffective. But it was scaled for, very quick, lightning campaigns against very alarmed opposition, such as Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, whatever, rather than a long campaign against a serious opponent. I'm not saying Libya was, it wasn't. But the point is, we ran out of missiles in trying to suppress the Libyans. After 3 days, it had to be replenished by the Americans. I could go on at length about our ships and our other elements of our industrial strategy. But what the Ukraine war has done is pointed that up. And as you said, it will take years to get this in gear. The particular problem is things like not only missile stocks. I mean, we're pretty good on certain kinds of missiles, to be frank, but because we're not handing over tomahawks and that sort of thing, rightly so, I think. But we are handing over HIMARS and especially artillery ammunition. So the Brits gave to the Ukrainians, for example, last week 10,000 shells. It was trumpeted. Look, we gave them 10,000 shells. We also gave them 3 ancient helicopters, Sea Kings. Designed in, I think 1962, deployed in our ones, I don't know, late 70s. And anyway, look, they're going to use them for search and rescue, and good luck to them. But I mean, that's neither here nor there. But anyway, the 10,000 artillery shells, it's a lot for us, but it's also about 1 day's expenditure, depending on which caliber it is. I don't know which it was, I guess it's 155. And that brings another thing up, you see, because Ukraine has now got, and this is somebody told me the other day, that this is a nightmare of a logistical process. It's a logistical nightmare for everybody. So, for example, on the artillery front, you have 14 artillery systems handed over to the Ukrainians.
That's right.
Now, they all use they use the same shells, but they don't use the same charges. Artillery shell, it's just one example, right? So artillery has a shell, so you can put the shell up the gun tube, and then what you have to do is you put the charges up, right? So then how many charges and what strength they'll dictate where the shell goes. But the trouble is that the charge bags are different for many of these different systems. So you can't afford to put the charge bags for one system into another, or the gun will miss, or it'll explode. Well, it won't explode, but it will miss. So that's just a start, right? Because then you have the spares. Because the thing about artillery guns is that the tubes wear out, or they overheat, or there are problems in them, or whatever. The balance doesn't work, so you need to replace them. Or the wheel might get bent, might get struck by counterbat, whatever. All kinds of things can happen. But the point is, they always need to return for spares. So you'd have 14 lines of logistics, maintenance, and spares going right back into Poland and beyond into the US, UK, France, Slovakia, Sweden, Netherlands, and all these other places are going to these systems. So they have multiple systems now, and it's very, very difficult. But above all, they're going to get run short eventually of ammunition because, as you said, we have not produced scales of ammunition and kept them at some point, let's put it this way, they're going to run seriously short, and that's where this industrial strategy and the lack of it will start to bite. And the Americans are starting to get very worried about that, rightly so. But then the other side of it is, well, okay, well, if not now, when? I mean, you made that point yourself earlier. If not now, when? Because every shell that goes towards the Russian causes casualties. Is the fewer casualties that we're going to have to fight. Or every missile that goes into a Russian patrol boat is one less patrol boat we're going to have to fight, or etc. etc. It's not as if we're firing anti-submarine missiles at people. So my own view for us, so I think to move from the move to the prescriptive from the descriptive is that if not now, when? Give the Ukrainians what they need to win the war. Move away from this rather risky approach of a far more risky approach, I think, of a long war, because war is contingent, can always go wrong, things can happen you don't want to have happen. Get it done quickly. That will save people's lives, Ukrainian and Russian, by the way. Win it to the point that to the extent that the Ukrainians can win it, which is to say, retake their land. Now, the question is back to that Crimea, and I think that's where we can exercise pressure. But the rest of it, if we give them the tools, they will finish the job. They've demonstrated that capability. We are not really dedicated to giving them the tools. We've given them some excellent capabilities, but in terms of quantity, to be honest, it's I won't say it's little. It's not little, but we need a step change, move up to a different gear, and then give them the tools so that Zaluzhny can equip his brigades, defeat the Russians, and by the way, ensure that the Russians can't do this kind of thing again. That's the only thing I'll say about prescription rather than description.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with the University of Portsmouth, Dr. Frank Ledwidge. Frank, I think there seems to be a race on in this phase of the war, and the race is between whether Ukraine's counteroffensive can keep up its momentum before newly mobilized Russian forces hit the ground in Ukraine. The reason why I raise this is because should Russia deploy, say, 100, 150,000 conscripts, raising the Russian force in Ukraine to the same level as it was at the onset of hostilities, even if they are barely trained rabble, the cost for Ukraine to remove them will be very high. Can a strategy of displacing a smaller Ukrainian force with untrained Russian manpower have the desired effect of forcing Kiev to the negotiating table if the cost of rooting out Russian forces from occupied Ukraine becomes too high?
Concerning manpower, the Russians, as everyone knows, have that rather serious problem.
Yeah.
And they've mobilized somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people. I won't dwell on the training they're going to get, because, to be honest, it cuts both ways. So the best trained Ukrainian soldiers coming into the line now are those being trained in Europe by Brits, Poles, and French, and all the other. I'm not sure about the French, but Americans and so forth. Maybe the French are, I don't know. And I think they get a 5-week course. So the Russians were all complaining, or we're all laughing at them because they get a 2-week course. Well, you know, to train an infantryman in Australia or the UK is 12 weeks plus basic.
Correct.
So nobody is going to get that level of training. However, that's going to be offset by the urgency of, you know, you cut down on the drill, and you increase the shooting and the small unit tactics and so forth. So probably that, you know, the Ukrainian troops that are trained by Brits, Poles, etc., are going to be quite well trained. Less so the Russians. Yeah. So the Ukrainians, though, they don't really have a manpower problem. Some people claim that they've had conscription issues. I don't think that's true. I think Ukraine has an effective, if not necessarily a highly efficient system for recruiting and training its troops, as we've seen. The Russians have not. So let's assume in terms of training, just put that aside, capability. The key issue here is the moral component. So I've just talked there about the material component of war. So you have material, moral, and human component. There are three. Never mind. There's 3 components of warfare. So conceptual. There's the human, and there's the moral, material, and the moral. Conceptual, material, and moral. So in terms of the moral component, if you're defending your country, you have a significant advantage. That's where the Crimea will come in, if it ever does, because the Russians then will be defending their land. Right now, almost all Russians understand that they're not, and therefore the Ukrainians have that edge. The Ukrainians also have the edge in manpower, I would say. They will at least have parity with the number of Russian soldiers deployed on the ground. We mustn't overstate the numbers here, because I think Putin declared in October that 80-something, may have just made up off the top of his head, but let's say, what point he made was 82,000 soldiers have been deployed, of whom 41,000 had gone to Ukraine at that point. That doesn't matter the numbers. The point that's made there, it's quite interesting, is that you don't deploy everybody to the front. You need a tail, you need support, and so forth. Now, many of those soldiers, by the way, will be displacing regulars or contract troops in the rest of Russia. Couldn't otherwise have been displaced. So yes, the situation is complex. Is this going to impose an unacceptable cost on Ukraine? No, because I'm not sure that the Ukrainians acknowledge the idea of an unacceptable cost. I'm not here to heroize them or laud them, but that's the case for any country defending itself. And Ukraine is not a country that's been let's put it this way, they're tough people, much tougher than, I think, Brits or French now, or Belgians or what have you, and the country is essentially unified behind that. They are much closer in spirit to the, let's say, the Germans or the Russians or the Soviets or the Poles of the Second World War than we are. So that they are not, they're taking very considerable casualties as it is, far more, I think, than we are told or led to believe, far more.
Yeah.
When I talk to Ukrainian friends, they say these casualties are starting to come home, which is to say, it might be a neighbor might have lost them, or a brother, or what have you. And that they're willing to take those casualties. And the point behind that is that it would be very difficult to find to determine an unacceptable cost for Ukraine. The issue is, can they do it? And the answer to that will depend on the scale of weapons that the West is willing to give them, frankly, to reinforce these brigades. That's the question. Otherwise, we're looking, frankly, at possibly at a frozen conflict, barring the possibility, if we sort of ignore the possibility, which I don't think we should, of cascade collapse of Russian forces, which, if we're to believe our own propaganda, is not unlikely.
Yeah,
well,
we'll come to that.
Propaganda.
We'll come to that, because there's something quite fundamental to that very aspect. So let's look at this. There were recent reports that a Ukrainian unit had shot surrendering Russian soldiers, with this alleged atrocity being captured on drone footage. How much stock do you put into this? And if the Ukrainians were to push Russian forces too hard, could we see a potential repeat of America's 1991 highway of death in Iraq, were Russian forces to start a full-scale retreat? Would this surely play to Putin's advantage from a propaganda perspective?
Yeah, it could do. The last element of that, of Ukrainians taking advantage of Russian retreats, absolutely, if it were to be a cascade, chaotic collapse. I don't think that'll happen. The last time it happened was, strategically, it was 1917, and of course the political things going on there, which caused the front to collapse, which is not impossible, of course. And I think it's that to which the West is really driving. I think that'll be an ill-advised thing to do, since all of the regime changes that we've effected over the last X years, where X is several hundred, but particularly more recent, have gone terribly wrong. And I don't speak to lots of people all the time, but people I do speak to are quite well accoutred with things and knowledge and what have you. And the dissident Russian person I spoke to, very well connected, she said, "Look, you better be very careful what you wish for, because a collapse in Russia will not be good for anybody."
No, it won't. No, absolutely not.
So yes, we could see that. We didn't see it in Kherson, though, did we?
No.
The Russians achieved a very effective retreat, and a little bit of deception, I think, there. I don't think there was a deal done with the Ukrainians. It might have been to go out in that way, but I think it was just rather they replaced their 76th Air Assault Division, who were defending that area, and a couple of other elite units of naval infantry, with conscripts, and then the conscripts were running over the bridge on the last day, if you see what I mean. So and they did that over a period of weeks. So it's quite clever, that. Because otherwise, you would expect, I think the Americans call it a retrograde, but basically retreat under fire is very, very difficult to do. And we were all expecting the Russians to lose thousands of prisoners, and they didn't. Okay, and I think that's down to Suvorikov, Surovikin, the new commander, and his subordinates, who clearly planned that quite well. But look, back to the other thing about war crimes. Yeah, that the case you spoke of, which the New York Times came up with, I had a look at that. And I do some, I've got quite reasonable experience in war crimes investigations in the past, going back quite a long time. And yes, that seems to me to have been a shooting of soldiers who'd surrendered. The only question is the precise circumstances. But that incident, was captured on camera. And look, we've seen that before. We saw it before in March, again captured on camera. Ukrainians say it wasn't us, Gov. Russians did it and then handed up for us. This time they say they're going to investigate it, which they won't. Or if they do, there'll be nothing will happen. There've been no prosecutions of Ukrainian soldiers for war crimes. I know of perhaps one, but that was a while ago. I'm not even sure of that. plenty of prosecutions rightly for Russian ones. But I think the Ukrainian problem may be, if they don't sort out this issue of murdering prisoners, and I don't think it happens a lot. Right? The Ukrainians take a lot of prisoners. They understand that if you take a prisoner, you can exchange that prisoner for a Ukrainian. They understand that. I think that these incidents are rare. But as Australia knows very well, and as the UK knows slightly less well, frankly, if you start committing war crimes, those will eventually have, and be caught doing it, thinking of Brereton, one SAS for you, right. Blackman for us, and many others. Then it starts to have a strategic effect. Now, what the Ukrainians cannot afford to have happen, and I did say this to them at the time when I was there, it doesn't matter what I said. Anyway, what they can't afford to have happen is something like the events that we saw in the New York Times, a little bit more unambiguous, of murdering non-combatant Russians, which is to say prisoners, or perhaps war crimes in retaken areas, displayed on Tucker Carlson in the US, because that is not, I'm not talking, this is a purely instrumental approach I'm taking. They shouldn't be doing it anyway. But if they're caught doing it, the narrative of the good Ukrainians against the bad Russians will start to corrode, and that will have strategic, decisive effect.
Exactly. Gosh, that is a big trouble, especially when you think that perhaps Donald Trump will have a successful run for the GOP in 2024. Right. It would be an absolute bloody disaster because he's got it out for the Ukrainians and he loves Putin. So, enough said.
Well, enough said, but that also highlights them in the Biden administration. I have to understand if they can either hand on it's not going to be a frozen conflict, but a rumbling Palestine-like conflict, which will go on for years and have a poisonous legacy for all of Eastern Europe and indeed all the rest of the world for years to come. Or they can decide we're going to help them win it this year, which is to say 23. And they have it in their gift or in their capability to do that. And my worry, and the Ukrainian worry, I think, is that American objectives are not connected with retaking Ukrainian territory, but more connected with tying up Russia in a dirty war for years, well, in a brutal, bloody, bleeding ulcer for years and years. And that's my worry. And we'll see if that's the case over the next few months, when the Americans will or won't make the decision to arm the Ukrainians properly to enable them to finish this war quickly, saving thousands of Ukrainian lives and also, as I say, Russians too, mainly Ukrainians.
We were talking about the United States and Ukraine relations, but obviously there are more players in Europe, for instance, that, they have got skin in the game. I mean, how influential is Brussels or the European capitals in being able to keep the Americans engaged in a way that would make sense for them? It's not just an American play thing we're looking at. We're looking at a global regional setting where there are multiple players of different strengths and capabilities. Each one of them will be going cap in hand to Washington saying, well, I think you ought to be doing this, or I think perhaps if you do that, it'll work out better for us. Now, if people like Lloyd Austin, sit back and say, well, you can tell us whatever you want to tell us. In the end, we're going to march to our own beat. That's going to have a corrosive effect on NATO for sure, and the transatlantic alliance more generally.
Well, yeah, especially if it's only 2 years, less than 2 years now to a new 2 years to a new administration, whatever that administration is. And between then and now, of course, doesn't matter if it's a new administration or not, or rather a Republican one. The point is that the politics are going to start playing in America way more than they have been in the midterms, especially if Trump stands and DeSantis has to dance a little bit to the right for that. Who knows? These are speculative. But back to Germany, Germany. EU, which is the same.
It's all right. It's an honest mistake.
Yeah, but we're out of it. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, one thing you are starting to see now in late November, it's summer for you, and of course it's coming to winter for us. We're just seeing the start of ennui about this in Europe. Now, don't think that will be reflected by the elites in Brussels or Berlin yet. But as the winter bites and the costs go up, and of course it has suited, I think wrongly, our betters to blame everything on the Ukraine war, then if our leaders continue to blame everything on the Ukraine war rather than perhaps the trillions of debt that we've built up over the last few years over COVID and other things, then people will quite legitimately start to think, well, then why are we involved in all this?
Yeah.
I think we'll particularly see that in Eastern Europe. I'm thinking here of countries like Slovakia, border countries, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, which can less afford this kind of thing. And of course, Germany itself, which is a little bit lukewarm on it, on the war. How that will play back to Brussels, I really don't know. But at the grand strategic level you're talking about, I don't see a rift. I do see the US leading this. They've delivered probably 90% or so of the assistance, not 99, but 90, 85 possibly. They lead on this. I think they are allowed and permitted to lead on it strategically, because that's just the way it is. However, if there's a serious backlash in Germany, I don't think there will be, by the way, but if there is, it's possible, against the war, then we will start to see that kind of rift, which will be dangerous in the very, very long term. I think dangerous and terminal, maybe if the EU itself is a credible act.
Yeah. Now, finally, Frank, historians may well call this war the first true drone war, with both sides deploying drones on an unprecedented scale. How do you see drone warfare as it's being played out in Ukraine? And the reason why I say this is that a while back we spoke to Yale professor Samuel Moyne on how drones, robots, machine learning and AI is making war better. And by better, I'm saying more precise and discriminating and therefore more humane. What's your take on this from what you see happening? I mean, after all, the Russians aren't known for adopting Western methods of warfare and aren't particularly fussed about fighting a more humane war.
I'm aware of Dr. Moyne's views, which I think are highly laudable. However, I don't know that they allow for the realities of combat and the realities of different actors' operational strategic approaches, which you just hinted at. Drones of various kinds are only really as good as the operators behind them. And whilst they do allow for a certain degree of precision, depending on what kind they are, I think, I'm thinking now of our own use. They're only as good as, even if you use them precisely, they're only as good as the intelligence they receive for a start. So if you're, those who man aircraft will say that we should have and retain manned aircraft and manned systems, because in the case of the Air Force, air-minded, well, we've got this awareness that no one else has. That to me is nonsense. It's self-serving. I don't really, with all due respect to Sam Moyne, whose work is marvelous, and I fully understand the argument, I just don't have the same degree of trust in the systems that perhaps he has. I think there's a certain utopian, and I'm not saying this about him. I think his work is very realistic, actually. So I'm not having a go at him. But I think there is this idea that we can have warfare without bloodshed. But when you're on the ground, somewhere like, let's say the Balkans, or obviously Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, it's a complex and dirty and smelly and chaotic environment. And a guy in a tank with his 125mm gun trying to aim at a target is enmeshed in a multi-sensory, chaotic environment that a drone operator isn't. And to that extent, the destination of the shell is likely to be more wayward than the destination of a drone. However, if the tank's objective is a compound or a house, which is alleged to have enemy in it, and it doesn't, then the drone operator and the tank gunner is in the same position. And that's all part of the fog of war. And that's at the tactical level. the operational level, you hit the targets you are instructed to hit, but much the same applies. In other words, your targets and you're only as good as the intelligence you have. Now, on the precision, and this is quite controversial. So I don't really wouldn't want to be taken into context on this. A lot of Russian targets that have been, Ukrainians say, were civilian targets. Many of them were, but you touched yourself on one of the reasons for this. So a lot of Russian targets actually were military targets, but hit the wrong place. So coming back to the point, increased precision reduces civilian casualties. And I think many of the Russian strikes have been aimed at military targets, but hit civilian targets because the equipment wasn't capable of striking the target properly. I'm thinking of specific incidents actually I'm aware of, including one when I was there, Kiev. That's off the point. But I don't have the same. I won't say rosy tinted, but more positive angle on drones. I think humans will do what humans need to do to win wars, and if that's kill as many people as they need to kill, and then use drones to do it. If it's to reduce casualties, we should have done Afghanistan and places like that. I think is where Professor Moyne's approach is a lot more cogent. But in full-on state-on-state war, in environments filled with ordinary people and the chaos and mayhem of combat, I'm not sure that's the case. Soldiers will want to kill their opponents, and if civilians get in the way, they will.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that is the price that we pay for being on this planet and being surrounded with a great choice of killing instruments. Yeah. Anyway, Frank, look, thank you very much for a fascinating walkthrough and update of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. And if you don't mind, we could call upon you in the future as well.
Yeah, of course, John. It's always a great pleasure. And the reason it's a great pleasure is because you're so well informed and
thank you.
And such an excellent questioner. It's such a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much for that. Anyway, that's it for this episode. So we hope that you enjoy the show. My thanks to our guest, Dr. Frank Ledwidge, and producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, hitting the Media Center drop-down menu and clicking podcasts. The Focus can also be heard on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, iHeartRadio, and if you like to watch this and many other interviews we've conducted, head on to our The Focus Raw YouTube channel. Also, if you like what you've heard or watched, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. Every subscription we get or thumbs up you give helps the algorithm bump us up the digital ladder. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus.